Welcome to Rural Health Pulse. I'm Jim Kinnear, Chief Human Resources Officer at the Indiana Regional Medical Center. In this series, we focus on ideas and stories impacting the health of our region and explore the programs and initiatives designed to improve healthcare and wellness. This podcast is a collaborative effort of IRMC and Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Rural health is not limited to rural health care. Healthy environments with clean air and water promote the health of rural residents. In this episode, we will discuss the research of Dr. David Janetski regarding freshwater ecosystems. Healthy streams provide numerous benefits to the natural environment in our community. In addition to safe drinking water, streams provide opportunities for recreation and exercise and are an important part of a healthy community. To get started, can you provide our listeners with an overview of what freshwater ecosystems entail?
Yeah, so freshwater ecosystems, they entail the living and non-living components of streams, rivers, and wetlands. So it's a pretty big umbrella. My area of study is really mostly focused on streams. I've done some work in lakes as well. But mostly I focus on streams and the living things in streams and how they interact with the non-living part. So things like water quality, temperature patterns, human impacts, different chemicals that might be in the water, things like that.
So, thanks for sharing that overview of a little bit about what that means. Can you give some highlights of your research, any specific findings that you've focused on?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how far you want to go back. So my graduate work, I went to University of Notre Dame for graduate school. While I was there, we were studying the ecological effects of introduced Pacific salmon in the Great Lakes. So a lot of people don't know in the Great Lakes, the salmon that are there are actually from the Pacific Ocean. They were introduced back in the 60s to help control an invasive fish called the alewife and to provide viable fishery since some of the historical species had been kind of wiped out. So Pacific salmon are introduced to the Great Lakes, and most people are aware, when salmon reproduce, they migrate up into streams where they spawn. And after they spawn, they die and their carcasses decompose, and it leaves all kinds of nutrients and things. And so it was this interesting situation where you have an introduced species that has these sort of established, strong ecological impacts. And so I wanted to know how those introduced salmon were affecting the streams in the Great Lakes. And one of the interesting things we found is that because of the kind of legacy of industry in the Great Lakes region, especially around Lake Michigan, those salmon, because they're kind of top predators in the system, they accumulate certain contaminants like PCBs. And so when the salmon, which are sort of, you can kind of think of them as these little bags of contaminants, they move upstream, they die, they decompose, and those contaminants are left in the stream. So we wanted to know if the organisms that feed on the salmon are getting those contaminants and if there's implications for things like human consumption and stuff like that. So that was at least part of the study in the Great Lakes when I was a graduate student. Since I've gotten to IUP, I got to IUP about, this is my 9th year. So it's been since 2014 that I've been here. So since I've arrived to IUP, I guess I've had two areas of focus. One of them has been a local issue. Well, it's really a regional issue, which has to do with the legacy of coal mining. So looking at how these old coal mines are impacting the streams. So for those that don't know, some of the older coal mines, after they were abandoned, back 100 years or so ago, companies it wasn't really on their radar to sort of do anything to prevent future pollution from these abandoned mines. And so what happens is the abandoned mine fills up with water, the water reacts with certain metals in the rock, and eventually that water springs up somewhere, and those metals enter the stream. And so it has all kinds of impacts. There's thousands of impaired stream miles in Pennsylvania because of abandoned mines. So I've been looking at how those abandoned mines impact the living things in the stream, so like the aquatic insects and the fish, and also looking at patterns of recovery. There's been a lot of people doing great work to restore the impacted streams and treat that contaminated water. That's been going on for a long time. And so, that's been one area of focus for me, and really trying to get students involved with, studying those systems, learning about the issues, and looking at all sides of the issue. I try to remind students, the legacy of coal mining in Pennsylvania, some people look at that from a purely environmental perspective and think, oh, that was so terrible. But, of course, it was thanks to that industry that the economy was established here. A lot of the towns around here were established, and that was a really important part of the region for a long time, and still is. So there's always two sides to issues like that. So I try to remind students of that. The other thing that I've been studying quite a bit lately has to do with what are called road culverts. And this has actually gained some national attention recently, which is nice to see. Road culverts are anywhere a stream intersects with a road. They'll often be like a corrugated pipe that takes the stream under the road. It's just kind of a basic part of our infrastructure that most people don't even think about. But from the perspective of a fish, these culverts can often basically restrict the movement of a fish. And so if you imagine a fish trying to swim upstream, oftentimes this culvert, the downstream end, will have a little waterfall. Again, something most people don't even think about, but to a fish that becomes a significant barrier. And normally fish like to move up and downstream depending on the season and the water temperature. So if you take a watershed and cut it into a bunch of little chunks, that really disrupts the normal kind of behavior patterns and movement patterns of native fish. And so that's something that, again, government agencies, a lot of great biologists out there are working to replace those culverts with passable structures like bridges that the stream can flow freely underneath. So we've done some work. I've had a few grad students looking at this, where we will mark fish and monitor their movements after a culvert gets replaced, trying to figure out how quickly the fish reestablish their normal patterns and things like that. So
I'm just curious, how does that limitation of the ability of the fish to move ultimately impact the fish and freshwater supplies?
Yeah, and so I think a lot of that is, that's an active area of research. So from a kind of stepping back just from fish, more broadly in ecology as a discipline, I teach a lot about this in my classes, but there's this whole idea of connectivity and fragmentation, where if an ecosystem is connected, it can provide for more diverse habitats, higher numbers of species, and that's because the populations can move around, they can seek refuge when they need to when conditions aren't right in one given area. You have higher genetic diversity when you have a connected ecosystem. And a lot of human activities in streams and in terrestrial systems on land, a lot of human activities, even roads and things do this a lot. It takes those connected ecosystems and chops them up into little pieces. And so instead of one big community of organisms that can interact and move around, now they're isolated to these little patches. And for some species can persist okay in that situation. Others that rely on movement, which many do, they don't do so well in that situation. And so you see declines in biodiversity for that reason, declining genetic diversity. So those are some of the main impacts of fragmentation. So in streams, the same concept applies. If you fragment a stream, and I've seen this just anecdotally when I do stream surveys in the summer, is upstream of these road crossings, you'll often have fewer fish species than downstream because, if a species goes extinct upstream of the culvert and there's no way for fish to get through the culvert upstream, then that's just good. They're not going to reestablish, if that makes sense.
What's the potential long-term consequences of that impact on biodiversity?
Long term, it'd be along those same lines. And so if you have a lot of little headwater streams that are basically blocked by culverts, sometimes what might happen is that headwater stream in a drought year could go dry, right? Maybe it only happens 1 out of every 30 years. So it goes dry 1 year, all the fish die, and then there's water in it again. But if that barrier is in place, that road crossing, fish can't recolonize that stream. And so it'll just remain fishless unless that barrier is replaced with a passable structure. So that's something we see. That's an area that I would like to get. Actually, I have some plans to look into that more. But to answer your question, overall, when there's fragmentation, you see declines in overall biodiversity typically. It just changes the whole dynamics of the system. Populations become much less stable when they're small and kind of cut off from other populations. When you have opportunity for migration and gene flow, that really helps with population persistence. So, and those are things that apply to all sorts of different systems, not just streams. But in my work, I try to apply some of those concepts to streams. And it's really, for me, it's a lot of this is about taking these concepts that I've had the chance to work on and learn about and getting students involved with them and seeing where they take those ideas. So that's kind of the fun part of it for me.
Talking about the students,
Yeah.
what benefits do you see for the students from participating in some of these research opportunities?
Yeah, for the students, I'm in the ecology and conservation program here at IUP. So we have a pretty good sized program. We have about 72 students in our major, in our track within biology. It's the ecology, conservation, and evolutionary biology track. And so, I get a pretty good number of students that just volunteer to do research with me. Some of them stay on and become master's students. I think I've had 4 or 5 who were undergrads at IUP that stayed and worked on, did master's degrees in my lab. And my goal with the students is, those that are doing, participating and committed to research, I try to get them collaborating with an agency or an institution outside of IUP, just to get them kind of out of the IUP bubble. So some of the groups that we've collaborated with are like the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, Susquehanna River Basin Commission. And my goal with doing that is it kind of gets the student, it gets their foot in the door somewhere else and hopefully leads to maybe a temporary position with that agency or a similar agency and eventually into a career. So that's the ultimate goal, is to get them a permanent job in the career that they, want to be a part of. Yeah, so I've been really happy, and it's probably the aspect of my job that I'm most proud of is the students who go on and, are able to get permanent positions, in the field. So that's been great. There's students from my lab who are working for Fish and Wildlife Service. There's one who's working for a Freshwater Mussel Propagation Center. One's working for Fish and Boat Commission. There's others I'm forgetting about. Some others are doing PhDs, things like that. So I think, establishing or just getting them involved with outside institutions is really, really important. They get that extra perspective, not just the academic perspective. They get to see how managers are applying these concepts to actual conservation and restoration issues. So I think that's what it's all about. It's really fun to watch the students get into it and get excited and all that stuff.
Yeah, it sounds exciting, and it has to be rewarding to see students carrying on this research and furthering some of the work that you've started.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of them continue doing stuff similar to they did here. Others kind of go on and do different things, and so I'm fine with whatever, but it's exciting to see them have success in their career path. That's the big thing.
I'm curious, one of the big changes here on campus is science programs are getting a new home with the new Kopchak Hall.
Yes.
How do you, from your perspective of your work, feel about the new facility and the opportunities that it might open up?
Yeah, we're really excited. The new Kopchak Science Building it's amazing. It's going to be a big step up from the building we've been in Wyatt Hall, which is, there's a lot of history there, but I think most of us are ready to move on to a new building. So yeah, we've got new lab space. We've got a new museum space that some of my colleagues in the biology department have been working hard to kind of get established and get organized. I have a little bit of a hand in that, but not nearly as much as some others. What I really like about the new building is there's a lot more opportunity for students to be working in the building and be collaborating with each other. We have shared research spaces. There are spaces throughout the building for students to study and work and collaborate. We don't really have that in Wyatt Hall. It's much more hallways and classrooms, and that's about it. The new building has a lot more sort of common area type space where students can, like I say, sit and work and collaborate. So I think that's going to be a big thing for us. So we're really excited. We think that our program will have a lot to offer for incoming students. We've got a lot of faculty who bring in, they get grants, they bring in grant dollars, and they have exciting research going on. So we're really excited. We see our program as, on the up and up.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Jumping back a little bit to some of the work that you've done with Streamwater, you mentioned the impact of mining and also the culverts. Are there any other specific issues in Western Pennsylvania that impact Streamwater? And first thing coming to mind is power generation and some of those types of things and other industry in our area.
Yeah, so some of the issues that have historically been a problem with streams are things like sedimentation from removal of vegetation, stuff like that. So that kind of thing's been going on for, centuries around here, but it still remains one of the biggest problems. So that's probably the first thing I think of. We have a lot of problems with, some of it's from historical logging, some of it is from, landowners who probably just don't realize that when you remove the vegetation around a stream, and for example, if you mow your grass right up to the edge of the stream, that stream is now exposed to the sunlight, right? And most people probably wouldn't ever think of this, but it only takes, a few hundred meters of stream. If it's a tiny stream and it's exposed to the sunlight, that water can warm up, several degrees on a hot day. And just that change of a few, 4 or 5 degrees can make a big difference for the things that live in the stream. And so we call that thermal pollution. I just taught about this to my class. I have a freshwater ecology class right now. So thermal pollution is a big deal, and you see a lot of work of conservation groups who go out and they try to restore that vegetation along the edge of the stream, which we call the riparian zone. So they go out and replant trees and try to get some shading on the stream. But you have to imagine, if you have a watershed and, it's mostly private property and people are mowing their grass right up to the edge of these headwater streams. If that's happening at a large enough scale, by the time that water gets down into the main stem river, it's going to be a lot warmer than it was historically. And so just that alone can really change what fish can survive in the stream. So that combined with erosion and sedimentation, those remain some of the biggest issues in streams. We have the abandoned mine drainage problem. That's pretty widespread around here. But even then, you still see, streams kind of here and there that are pretty healthy. But even the healthy streams are impacted by thermal pollution and sedimentation. So those are the first things I think of. Are kind of in stream ecology, they'd be considered kind of the persistent long-term issues, but they remain some of the most important. And sometimes I think they get overlooked because they've been around so long. We have a tendency to want to go to the next exciting thing, whether it's, fracking or climate change. Those things are definitely important, but we shouldn't forget about these persistent kind of long-term issues either.
And that example of thermal pollution, I think that was really interesting because I think it's something that most people wouldn't think of unless they were aware of that issue.
Right.
And it really just reinforces that delicate balance of how something very seemingly simple has a tremendous impact.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things too where if people are just aware of it, it's not a difficult thing to just say, okay, I'm only going to mow up to maybe within 5 meters of the stream and let the grass grow around it or some shrubs. Probably a lot of people would be willing to do that if they were just aware of the issue. So yeah, and that's where the education side comes into play. I was actually out with some students in the field doing some fish surveys, and we came across a landowner who was the IUP graduate. He went through the geoscience program here at IUP. So we got to talking to him, and it was really nice to see because he had a full awareness of the issues that we were trying to address. He even went on to tell us how, he deliberately leaves a buffer around the stream where the grass grows high. And I was like, oh, great. So yeah, you learned some of the concepts that we were trying to get across in the program. He went through geoscience, but they talk about a lot of the same kinds of things. stream dynamics. So that was really nice, and that's why education, I think, is so critical. I think everyone means well, but if they don't know, about these issues, if they're not aware, how can they do anything about it? So,
As we think about this, how does the integrity of freshwater systems ultimately impact safe drinking water?
yeah. So I think obviously everything depends on clean water at some level, and humans are no different, right? And there are folks at IUP who are actually involved with monitoring water supplies. I'm going to get a little bit beyond what I deal with on a day-to-day basis, but for example, I think it's Beaver Run Reservoir. Faculty here at IUP who are involved with monitoring the water there. So in an extreme case, and the case I mention in my class probably most often has to do with things like nutrient pollution in lakes. And this is another one probably a lot of people aren't aware of. The scale at which we do farming now, one of the consequences of that, it's necessary because we have to feed our population, but one of the consequences is when fertilizer is applied to crops, the excess fertilizer runs downstream. Eventually, it funnels its way down to a lake. And if that excess fertilizer reaches a certain point, you can have algal blooms, and some of those algae can actually be toxic. And this is an issue in Lake Erie, and there are groups that actually monitor the water quality at the beaches, looking for harmful algal blooms. There have been cases where dogs have died that drink contaminated water. And so they monitor every single day the beaches up in Erie so that they can alert swimmers and people with dogs to stay out of the water. So that's a case where you see this direct connection between human activities and water quality and then human health. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. In streams, usually all reservoirs and lakes are fed by streams. And so if the lake is polluted, it's because of what's going on in the streams that surround it. And so nutrient pollution is a big thing that affects water quality. Of course, you have, things like toxic metals and things that can be a problem. But my research more focuses on their impacts on wildlife. Mm-hmm. I don't know as much about how those, the metals and things might impact drinking water.
To that point, earlier, safe drinking water was something that came to mind earlier, but then when you were talking about the work that you had done with the Great Lakes with salmon fishing, mm-hmm. Just thinking in Western Pennsylvania, a lot of recreational fishing, a lot of recreational hunting, and in addition to the water supply, potentially some impact on the food supply mm-hmm. as individuals are partaking in some of those activities.
Yeah, definitely, and there are, and that's something every fisherman should be aware of is. And I think a lot of them are aware of this, but every state will publish consumption advisories. And a consumption advisory is simply, it's a recommendation for how many meals of a particular fish species you should have in a month or in a year or something like that. And it's all based on the amount of contamination in the fish. So state and federal agencies will regularly monitor things like mercury, or PCBs and other organic pollutants in fish so that they can publish these consumption advisories. And so if you're a fisherman and you like to go out and keep a lot of fish and eat them, it's something you want to be aware of, especially, they always have more strict advisories for example, women who are pregnant or are trying to become pregnant. So you want to be aware of those because there are definitely, implications for health. So yeah, you wouldn't want to go out for the most extreme examples would be your top predatory fish and fish that live a long time. So you wouldn't want to go out and catch 20-pound catfish and eat them on a regular basis, right? That would be, if you wanted to get the most contamination, that would be the way to do it. But your smaller fish that feed on plankton and insects tend to have lower levels of contamination. So like sunfish, bluegill, things like that tend to have lower. Even smaller trout are generally pretty low in contamination. It's those large species that are at the top of the food chain that tend to have the highest contamination. But that said, it also varies by water body. And so if you're going out to fish and you plan to keep a bunch of fish and feed your family, it's always a good idea to check those advisories just so you're aware.
Thank you for sharing that. I think in this conversation, what's really been interesting is just seeing the connections of how human behavior impacts the streams, and then ultimately how those impacts in the stream come back and can impact us as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's really a lot of what I teach and what I talk about in my class. It's kind of it does kind of come full circle. That's a good way of putting it. There are so many different stressors that human activities put on aquatic systems. We cover, I talked about thermal pollution, I talked about nutrient pollution. There's also things like salts that we put on the roads in the winter that has impacts. We covered sedimentation and riparian zones. There's a lot more that I'm not thinking of at the moment. Oh, another big one is presence of things like pharmaceuticals in the water. So whenever people take you take some kind of medication, some kind of drug, it works its way through your system, ends up in the sewers. Some of that might get treated at the wastewater plant. A lot of it ends up in the streams, and so you end up with kind of this cocktail of different compounds, most of which are not natural. And we're still learning a lot about how those impact things like fish and aquatic insects and things. There's a lot we don't know. It's a very active area of research. So yeah, that's just another example of the activities we have impacting the environment, and then they can impact everybody else. So
Thanks for sharing that. And it really is interesting just to see the additional research that's needed to continue to understand our environment, and ultimately these things all come back to affect us having a healthy environment, a healthy community, and healthy people.
Right. Yeah, and I think one aspect that I always like to stress to my class, I talked about contaminated fish and things, and it's kind of sort of easy to see there kind of the direct impact on human health. If you were to eat a lot of contaminated fish, it could potentially put you at higher risk for certain things. But another aspect of a clean environment that I think needs to get mentioned more often is just, if you're in a clean environment, I think people are more likely to be outdoors and enjoying the outdoors. And I think the link between, outdoor activity and just human well-being and mental health is pretty clear. I never like to assume it applies to everybody, because I'm sure there are many people who are perfectly happy avoiding the outdoors. But I think for a lot of people, and myself included, that's a big part of their life. Being outdoors, enjoying a clean environment really is a positive aspect of life. And so I think that's one of the things that should get talked about a lot more, and is a big benefit. Nobody wants to live, I talk about this in my class. There's a reason property values are much, much higher on a nice crystal clear lake than they are next to a big factory with the brown lake, right? It's because, it affects your mood, it affects well-being. It also affects clean water. That's an obvious one, but there are other aspects that I think are much harder to kind of quantify, and so maybe they don't get talked about as much, but I think they're very real, and I think it should be a big driver of us trying to maintain clean water and a clean environment.
I think that's a really important point, and just that holistic view of health and wellness, and the recreational values of our lakes and streams, and also the exercise and being outside and being active and getting sunlight and all those positive things that coming from having a clean and positive environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the recreation part, because that kind of goes along with what I was saying. That's another big thing to a lot of people, especially around here in rural communities. There are a lot of people who like to go out and fish and hunt, and many of those outdoorsmen end up being some of the biggest, loudest voices for the environment, right? Because they want to preserve these places where they grew up, and they went hunting and went fishing, and so the prospect of losing that is a big deal to many, many people who live in rural communities. And so I think that's something that's important to mention too, is that recreational side of it is a big motivator for preserving and conserving and restoring ecosystems.
Well, Dr. Janetski, thank you so much for sharing some of your important work, and I think it's really given listeners some really insights into the importance of our freshwater streams and our environment, and probably some things that we'll think about next time that we're out enjoying those. Is there anything that you'd like to add that we didn't get a chance to cover?
I think I'm happy with it. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great opportunity. So,
thank you. Research plays a critical role in the creation of new knowledge and helps universities such as IUP to fulfill their societal mission. Research also offers the opportunity to address rural health challenges with evidence-based solutions. Rural Health Pulse is a collaborative effort of the Indiana Regional Medical Center, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and the Indiana community. It is produced by Chris Korn from IUP's Division of University Advancement and recorded by the IUP Communications Media. I'm Jim Kinnear. Thank you for listening, and be sure to watch for future episodes of Rural Health Pulse. Research plays a critical role in the creation of new knowledge and helps universities such as IUP to fulfill their societal mission. Research also offers the opportunity to address rural health challenges with evidence-based solutions. Rural Health Pulse is a collaborative effort of the Indiana Regional Medical Center, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and the Indiana community. It is produced by Chris Korn from IUP's Division of University Advancement and recorded by the IUP Communications Media. I'm Jim Kinnear. Thank you for listening, and be sure to watch for future episodes of Rural Health Pulse.